On January 1, 2024, at 4:10 p.m., a magnitude 7.6 earthquake tore through Japan's Noto Peninsula. Over 240 people died. Thousands more were pulled from the rubble of homes that had stood for centuries. But that's not what keeps seismologists awake. What has them watching the seafloor monitors, double-checking their instruments, and quietly briefing government officials is this. The Noto quake may not be an isolated event. It may be a symptom. Beneath Japan's southern coast lies the Nankai Trough, a subduction zone that has been unsettlingly quiet for 78 years. The last time it ruptured, in 1946, it killed over 1,400 people. The time before that, in 1854, it killed thousands more. And every single time it has broken in recorded history, something happened first. A sequence, a pattern in the crust. The kind of pattern that seismologists now see unfolding again, 700 kilometers to the north, beneath the Noto Peninsula. The shaking begins. The shaking started at 4:10:22 p.m. Within 15 seconds, the ground beneath Wajima City had lurched 3 meters to the west. Wooden merchant houses, some over 200 years old, folded in on themselves as their foundations slid sideways. The main shock lasted 47 seconds. By the time it stopped, the coastline had been permanently displaced. Roads had cracked open, and tsunami sirens were wailing across 9 prefectures. Over 90,000 people evacuated inland, moving away from the sea as the first waves began to arrive. In Suzu, the closest city to the epicenter, entire neighborhoods went dark. Power lines snapped, water mains burst, landslides buried mountain roads, cutting off access to villages where search teams knew people were trapped. But seismologists reviewing the data that night saw something in the waveforms that made them go quiet. The aftermath. By January 2nd, the death toll stood at 48. By January 5th, it had climbed to 168. The final count, weeks later, reached 241 confirmed dead. Rescuers worked through freezing temperatures, digging through collapsed structures in towns where no heavy equipment could reach. In Wajima's old market district, fires ignited by ruptured gas lines burned through the night. Smoke drifted over streets filled with debris, where families searched for neighbors buried under timber beams and ceramic roof tiles that had shaken loose after 300 years. The cold was the second killer. Overnight temperatures dropped to -2 degrees Celsius. Survivors huddled in evacuation centers without heat, without running water, waiting for roads to be cleared so supply trucks could get through. And then the aftershocks began to tell a story of their own. The pattern. By the end of the first week, seismographs had logged more than 1,200 separate tremors. That alone would be unsettling, but it wasn't the count that caught the eye of researchers. It was the shape. When you plot those epicenters on a map, they don't scatter randomly. They fall into a line, a narrow trace running roughly 150 kilometers along the coast. That line is a rupture, the visible signature of rock tearing along a fault. And here's what made geologists lean in closer. The trace didn't follow a single known fault. It crossed several, stitching them together as if they'd been one system all along. When a fault slips like that, it doesn't just release stress. It shifts the load onto whatever lies next door, quietly pressing on faults that were, until that moment, holding still. But this particular stretch of coast has a history most people have never heard of. The peninsula. Picture a narrow finger of land reaching out into the Sea of Japan, the Noto Peninsula. It hooks northward off the main island of Honshu, ringed by cliffs and quiet coves, the kind of coastline that looks almost untouched by the modern world. Fewer people live here every year. The towns are old, and the young have largely gone to the cities, leaving fishing villages and terraced fields tended by hands that have worked them for decades. Along the shore, salt farmers still gather seawater by hand, letting the sun and wind do work that machines took over almost everywhere else centuries ago. It's the sort of place you'd pass through slowly, watching the water, breathing in the salt air, feeling far from anything urgent. What no guidebook mentions is that this peninsula has been rising, measurably, steadily, for the past 3 years. The uplift. The land itself was moving upward, not in some sudden lurch you could feel underfoot, but in a slow creep, about 4 centimeters a year since 2020, tracked by GPS stations dotted along the coast. You could see it if you knew where to look. Beaches widened as the sea pulled back from them. Tide pools that once filled with every wave sat stranded, dry and glinting above the waterline, marooned a little higher each season. Scientists watched the numbers climb and knew something beneath the peninsula was pushing it skyward. What they couldn't say was what, exactly. The mechanism stayed hidden, a steady pressure with no clear source. And the timing of that uplift? It lines up almost perfectly with something else. The swarm. Starting in late 2020, the ground beneath the Noto Peninsula began to stir. Not one quake, but thousands of them, clustered in a tight zone deep under the surface. Most were so faint, no one standing there would have felt a thing. But the seismometers saw them, lighting up night after night, like a slow-burn firework that refused to fade. By 2023, the count had climbed past 50,000 recorded tremors. Scientists watching the data saw a pattern taking shape, and it pointed downward, to something pushing up from below. The best explanation was fluids, or maybe magma, forcing their way through cracks in the crust, wedging the rock apart millimeter by millimeter. That was the engine behind the uplift. Every swarm quake was the sound of pressure finding a path, prying open the ground from the inside. It looked almost gentle from the outside, a quiet buzzing on a chart. But that swarm was only warming up the faults for what came next. The rupture zone. On January 1st, the northern edge of that swarm zone gave way. Decades of accumulated strain, held in the rock like a coiled spring, let go in roughly 60 seconds. The fault didn't slip all at once. It tore, opening from one point and racing outward along its length. The rupture propagated toward the northeast, unzipping the fault at about 2.5 kilometers per second. That's slower than most quakes of its size, and the difference mattered. A slower tear means the shaking arrives spread out over more time, so the ground rolled and heaved for longer than it should have. For the people standing on it, those extra seconds were the difference between a house swaying and a house coming down. The fault stretched more than 100 kilometers by the time it stopped, and that slow rupture left something behind, a stress shadow pointing directly at Japan's most dangerous fault system. The Nankai Trough. Off Japan's southern coast runs a scar in the seafloor called the Nankai Trough. It stretches roughly 900 kilometers, from the waters near Tokyo down toward the southwest. Here, the Philippine sea plate slides beneath the edge of Japan, grinding down at a few centimeters a year, locking and loading with every passing decade. When a fault like this finally lets go, it doesn't produce an ordinary earthquake. It produces a megaquake, magnitude 9, the kind that reshapes coastlines and sends walls of water inland. The Nankai Trough has done this on a rhythm roughly every 100 to 150 years for as long as records exist. The last full rupture came in 1946. Do the arithmetic, and the trough sits at the near edge of its own cycle. By the count that has held for centuries, we are overdue. But the Noto quake didn't happen on the Nankai Trough. It happened 400 kilometers away. The question. So here's the question that has quietly divided seismologists for decades. Can a large earthquake in the crust, hundreds of kilometers from a subduction zone, reach across all that rock and nudge a sleeping megathrust toward rupture? For most of the last century, the answer was a careful no. The math didn't seem to allow it. The stress that ripples out from a crustal quake fades fast and spreads thin, and by the time it reaches a fault 400 kilometers away, it's a whisper, not a shove. A single earthquake, in isolation, almost certainly can't pull that trigger. The forces are too small, too scattered. But Japan doesn't keep its earthquakes in isolation. It keeps records, And those records stretch back further than almost anywhere on Earth. When you lay them out end to end, something unsettling starts to show. Because this exact sequence has happened before. The precedent. On the 11th of March 2011, the seafloor off northeastern Japan tore open along 500 kilometers of fault. A magnitude 9.1 megathrust, the most powerful quake in the nation's recorded history. The ground shifted so violently that Japan's main island slid more than 2 meters east, and the planet's rotation quickened by a fraction of a microsecond. Then came the water, a tsunami that in places climbed past 40 meters, higher than a 10-story building, folding over seawalls that engineers had called sufficient. More than 18,000 people were lost. At Fukushima, the waves drowned the backup generators, and 3 reactor cores melted down. And here's the detail that lingers. 3 days earlier, a magnitude 7.3 quake had struck about 40 kilometers away. Researchers later recognized it as a foreshock, a warning written in the ground. At the time, no one knew, no one evacuated, and the geological record shows that pattern repeating across centuries. The archives. Japan has been writing its earthquakes down for more than 1,400 years. Buddhist temples logged the shaking in their diaries. Court officials recorded which villages the sea swallowed. Fishing families carved the tsunami's reach into stone and passed the stories down through the generations, grandparent to child, for hundreds of years. When modern researchers gathered all of it, the diaries, the markers, the spoken histories, and lined the dates up against the Nankai Trough's known ruptures, a rhythm emerged. Again and again, a large crustal earthquake in western Japan came first, months before, sometimes a few years before, and then the trough let go. It's not proof. Coincidence hides easily across centuries, and correlation stalks these old records like a shadow. But the pattern is there, quiet and persistent, waiting in the archives. One case in particular keeps coming up in the scientific papers published since January. The year 1854. It was the winter of 1854. On December 23, the ground beneath the Tokai region tore open in a magnitude 8.4 quake, shaking the coast where Mount Fuji watches over the sea. Houses folded, the water pulled back from the shore, then returned as a wall. And it wasn't finished. Just 32 hours later, a second magnitude 8.4 ruptured the neighboring Nankai segment, as if the first had reached over and pulled the trigger on its neighbor. 2 of the largest quakes Japan had ever recorded, back to back, across a single sleepless day and a half. Together, they killed more than 3,000 people and redrew the coastline, lifting some harbors and drowning others. And here is the detail that unsettles the researchers reading these records now. 3 months earlier, a large quake had already struck the Sea of Japan coast, on the far side of the country. But the archives also record something most modern accounts leave out. The slow slip. Not every earthquake announces itself. Some faults slip so slowly that no one standing on the ground would ever feel a thing. The energy that a normal quake releases in seconds gets let out over weeks, even months. A movement so gentle it hides beneath the threshold of human sensation. We only know these silent earthquakes exist because of GPS. Across Japan, a dense network of stations tracks the land down to the millimeter, and every so often the numbers drift in a way no ordinary day explains. The ground is moving, quietly, deliberately. Beneath the Nankai Trough, these slow slips have been mapped creeping shoreward along the plate boundary. Each one loads a little more strain onto the locked megathrust zone, the great clasped seam that has stayed jammed for decades, nudging it a fraction closer to the moment it lets go. And in February 2024, instruments detected one beginning beneath Shikoku. The detection. It surfaced in the data about 6 weeks after the Noto quake. A patch of the plate interface, roughly 30 kilometers down, had begun to move, slipping just a few centimeters over 10 days. On a screen, it's a soft curve bending away from where it should be. On the seafloor, it's a section of Earth quietly changing its mind. A few centimeters sounds like nothing. But in the simulations researchers run of the Nankai megathrust, this is exactly the kind of nudge that can unclasp a locked fault, the small, silent release that tips a much larger one into motion. It's the difference between a door that's held shut and a door that's simply resting closed. The Japanese Meteorological Agency noticed. They issued an advisory, worded carefully, kept low and calm, the language of people who don't want to start a panic over a curve on a graph. What they didn't announce publicly was where that slow slip was located. The epicenter gap, it sat beneath Tokyo Bay. Seismologists have a name for the quiet stretch of the Nankai Trough that runs through there. They call it the Tokai Gap, a segment about 150 kilometers long that last let go in 1854 and has said almost nothing since. On the maps, it reads like a held breath. The segments on either side have slipped in smaller quakes over the decades, releasing strain in manageable pieces. This one hasn't. It's locked, storing energy the way a bent steel bar stores force before it snaps back. That's what made the slow slip so unsettling. It wasn't happening in some empty patch of seafloor off in the distance. It was nudging the edge of the one segment that had stayed silent for 170 years, the one everyone had quietly agreed not to think about too hard. And that gap sits directly beneath 38 million people. The megacity. Greater Tokyo is the largest urban economy on Earth, roughly 38 million people packed into a sprawl that never really ends. And it's built on soft ground. The whole region sits on sedimentary basins, layers of loose sediment that don't just carry seismic waves, they amplify them, stretching and slowing the shaking like a bowl of water sloshing long after you stop moving it. The towers know this. Tokyo's high-rises are engineered to sway, riding the motion instead of fighting it, some fitted with counterweights and fluid dampers that shift as the building leans. But there's a limit no engineer has ever measured against. A magnitude 8 or greater megathrust wouldn't shake for 20 seconds. It would shake for 4 to 6 minutes, longer than any modern building in Tokyo has ever been tested against, real or simulated. Nobody knows what happens at minute 5. But Tokyo isn't the only city in the crosshairs. The southern cities. The Nankai Trough doesn't stop at Tokyo Bay. It curves southwest for hundreds of kilometers, and it traces a line past nearly every major city on Japan's Pacific coast. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Shizuoka, names that already carry the memory of the ground moving. Kobe was rebuilt after 1995, when a quake killed more than 6,400 people in under 20 seconds. This whole stretch was rebuilt after the Nankai ruptures of 1944 and 1946 tore through it in the final years of the war. The cities came back bigger, denser, closer to the water. And what came back with them raises the stakes. Ports handling a huge share of Japan's trade, oil refineries and petrochemical plants, nuclear stations along the coastline, residential districts where millions live just a few meters above sea level. And every one of them sits within the tsunami inundation zone mapped by the government in 2012. The wave. The Cabinet Office ran the simulation in 2013, a magnitude 9.1 rupture along the full length of the Nankai Trough, wave height at Kochi, 34 meters, time to arrival, 3 minutes. Evacuation routes climb the hillsides, painted in blue and white. Seawalls have been reinforced, some to 15 meters. Emergency towers stand at intersections. The models assume people will have time to reach them. In Kuroshio, a fishing town on the southern Cape, the wave model shows water overtopping the seawall 2 minutes after the first shock. The shaking itself is forecast to last 4 minutes, which means the ocean arrives while people are still trying to stand. And the geological evidence suggests the models may be conservative. The tsunami stones. Along the Pacific coast, scattered through forests and half buried in fields, there are stones, hundreds of them, carved centuries ago by survivors who watched their villages disappear. The inscriptions vary. Some say, "Build your homes above this point." Others, "Remember the calamity of the great tsunami and the pain of those who perished." Most were placed in the 1700s and 1800s, after the megaquakes that defined those eras. During post-war reconstruction, when land was scarce and memory short, many were ignored. Housing developments rose in the lowlands. Schools were built in valleys that flooded twice before. After 2011, rescue teams found stones standing in the mud, dry and untouched, marking the exact line where the water stopped. One stone, recently rediscovered near Kochi, carries a date that doesn't match any earthquake in the written record. The invisible quakes. The written record in Japan begins around 684 AD. Before that, the earthquakes still happened. They just weren't written down. Sediment cores drilled from coastal marshes tell a different story. Layers of sand, each one deposited by a tsunami that swept inland and settled as the water drained back. Radiocarbon dating places them 1,340 years ago, 1,610 years ago, 2,100 years ago. The intervals are irregular. 90 years between some events, 147 years, 262 years. The longest gap in the sediment record is 310 years. It ended with a sand layer 8 centimeters thick, traced along 400 kilometers of coastline. Researchers estimate the wave height at 25 to 30 meters. And the current gap is already longer than the historical average. The clock. Go back to the last time the Nankai Trough let go. It was December 1946, and the southern segment ruptured at magnitude 8.1. 2 years before that, in 1944, the segment to the north had already broken at magnitude 7.9. Between them, those two quakes killed around 2,500 people. And here's what makes scientists uneasy. The Nankai Trough tends to rupture on a rhythm, roughly every 100 to 200 years, sometimes as tightly as 90. It's now been 78 years since 1946. That places us at the near edge of the shortest recurrence intervals ever recorded here, the window where the fault has broken before. The clock isn't just running. It's approaching a mark it has passed only after long silence. But timing isn't the only factor scientists are watching. The silent tension. Beneath the water, the Philippine sea plate is sliding under Japan at 4 to 6 centimeters a year. That sounds slow, and it is, about the pace your fingernails grow, but the two plates aren't sliding smoothly past each other. Friction locks them together along the interface, so while the deep plate keeps diving, the crust above it can't follow freely. It bends downward instead, dragged along, storing energy like a spring you're slowly compressing and holding. GPS stations scattered across southern Japan measure that bending millimeter by millimeter, year after year. The numbers tell a quiet story. The strain accumulated on the locked interface now amounts to somewhere between 3 and 4 meters of unreleased slip. That's the debt the plate boundary owes, and that debt doesn't pay itself off gradually. The release. When a megathrust finally fails, it happens in seconds. The locked interface tears loose and lurches upward, releasing everything it held. The seafloor jumps, and the entire column of ocean above it is thrown skyward, becoming a tsunami before anyone on shore feels a thing. On land, the crust that was bent down for decades snaps back. Coastlines can rebound, sometimes lifting or dropping by meters in an instant. The ground doesn't shift, it rings. In 2011, off Tohoku, the seafloor moved about 50 meters horizontally and rose nearly 10 meters vertically in a single event. 50 meters, in moments, along a fault that had seemed quiet. But the Nankai Trough has a feature that makes it even more dangerous than Tohoku. The branching faults. Picture the megathrust as the main seam where two plates lock together, deep beneath the water. But that seam doesn't rupture alone. Branching upward from it are shallower cracks, called splay faults, cutting through the seafloor like the veins spreading across a leaf. When the megathrust lets go, these splays can slip in the same instant, tilting the seabed and lifting the water column far more sharply than the main fault would on its own. That's how a quake turns an ordinary wave into something that erases coastlines. In 2004, off Sumatra, part of the catastrophic tsunami was driven by exactly this, a splay fault ripping upward and shoving the seafloor skyward. And sonar mapping, completed in 2018, found over 40 active splays along the Nankai Trough. The seafloor. After 2011, Japan decided it would never again be caught listening from shore, so it wired the deep ocean itself. Hundreds of instruments now rest on the seafloor, pressure sensors, seismometers, and tethered GPS buoys, strung together by fiber optic cable running back to land. When the seabed shudders or the water pressure above a sensor suddenly changes, the signal travels down that cable in a blink. The system can register a megathrust rupture in seconds and push out a tsunami warning before the first wave has even finished forming. It's the closest thing to hearing the ocean move before it moves, but there's a gap in the network that no one has figured out how to close. The blind zone. The densest part of that array, the thickest web of sensors, sits off northeastern Japan, blanketing the zone that ruptured in 2011. It's watching the scene of the last disaster with extraordinary care. The Nankai Trough is thinner ground. Its offshore sensors are spread farther apart, and the shallow splay faults, the ones that lift the water hardest, lie in water so deep that wiring them becomes brutally expensive. So much of that ground stays quiet in the data. And the math is unforgiving. If a rupture begins on one of those splays, closest to the coast and least observed, the warning time can collapse to under 90 seconds. And in April 2024, one of those sensors recorded something no one wanted to see. The tremor. It wasn't a jolt, it was a hum. 40 kilometers off the coast of Shikoku, the seafloor sensors picked up a low-frequency tremor, a deep and steady vibration threading up through the plate like a string being slowly bowed. A normal earthquake snaps in seconds. This lasted 18 hours. It was too slow, too soft, too patient to be a rupture, and that's exactly what made it worrying. Vibrations like these usually come from fluid moving along the plate interface, water and pressure squeezing through the boundary where one slab of the earth dives beneath another. Seismologists have a name for that signature. It often walks hand in hand with a slow slip event, a quiet creep of the fault that releases strain without a sound. Sometimes those tremors follow the slip, sometimes they arrive just before it. And when researchers cross-referenced the tremor's location with GPS data, the timing lined up with something else. The subsidence. Along the Kochi coast, the ground was sinking, not in any way you could feel, not cracks in the road or doors that wouldn't close. The GPS stations measured it in millimeters, a slow settling of the land in the final days of April, as if the coastline were being drawn gently downward. The cause sits deep beneath your feet. As the plate interface creeps further inland, it tugs the crust above it down with it, pulling the overriding rock toward the trench. On the Noto Peninsula, the land had risen, thrust upward, and left standing above the tide. Here, it was the reverse. Picture the megathrust as something breathing. The subsidence is the inhale, the fault drawing the coast down and inward, gathering, tightening, holding. Somewhere ahead of that breath is the exhale nobody wants to witness. But the subsidence stopped as suddenly as it started, and no one knows why. The silence. Then everything went quiet. The tremor faded from the records. The GPS needles drifted back to their baselines, the ground settling into stillness as though nothing had passed through it at all. The slow slip event either ended or it slipped away beyond the reach of the instruments watching for it. And that stillness split the scientists into two camps. To some, the silence is relief, the strain bled off gently, the danger easing back beneath the sea. To others, it reads the opposite way. A slow slip event can transfer stress onto the parts of the fault that never moved, loading them, priming them. In that reading, the quiet isn't the fault relaxing, it's the locked zone relocking, gripping tighter than before, storing every ounce of pressure the creep left behind. Nobody can say for certain which story is true, and that silence is what has Japan's Disaster Prevention Council preparing for the unthinkable. The warning system. When the ground finally moves, Japan doesn't wait for you to feel it. Buried in the crust, thousands of sensors listen for the first whisper of a rupture, the P wave, a fast, faint pulse that races ahead of the real destruction. It's weak enough that you'd never notice it, but the machines do, and in the space of a heartbeat, an algorithm reads its shape and guesses what's coming behind it. What's coming is the S wave, slower, heavier, the one that snaps beams and cracks foundations. The system races it, firing alerts to phones and trains and factory floors before the shaking arrives. When the Noto quake struck in 2024, Tokyo had about 80 seconds of quiet warning before the tremor reached it. For a full megathrust off the coast, that cushion shrinks. The capital would get 60 seconds at most, maybe less, to brace, to stop, to duck. It's a marvel of timing, measured in single breaths. But the system can't warn against the one thing that kills the most people. The fire. On September 1st, 1923, the ground beneath Tokyo tore open with a magnitude 7.9. The shaking alone was brutal, but it wasn't the shaking that killed 105,000 people. It was what came after, drifting in on the wind. It was lunchtime, and thousands of cookstoves were lit across a city built almost entirely of wood and paper. When the quake overturned them and ruptured the gas lines, the flames found endless fuel. A typhoon offshore fed the fire with wind, and the separate blazes merged into a single rotating firestorm that swallowed whole neighborhoods in minutes. In one open square where people had fled for safety, nearly 38,000 died in a matter of moments. Modern Tokyo is concrete and steel now, not paper. But a megathrust would rupture gas mains and sever water lines across a 200-kilometer radius. And the fire department has quietly admitted they don't have enough water trucks to fight fires in more than 3 districts simultaneously. The simulation. So in 2022, the government decided to rehearse the nightmare. They simulated a magnitude 9.1 Nankai megathrust and ran the whole country through it, minute by minute. 30 minutes of violent shaking, then the tsunami response, the scramble to move people to higher ground before the water arrived. On paper, the hospitals overflowed, roads closed, cutting off entire regions. Officials tried to track where the evacuees would go, how to feed them, how to move supplies through streets that no longer existed. The drill ran for 6 hours before they called it, and even that only covered the opening act. When the after-action report came back, it used 2 careful words: critical gaps, gaps in coordination, in who talks to whom, in where the resources actually go when the phones fail. Those gaps are still there, unresolved. But the simulation didn't include one variable, a winter scenario. The season. Think about when the Noto quake struck. January 1st, 2024, the first hours of the new year, in the coldest stretch of the Japanese winter. Roads along the peninsula were already narrow and mountainous, and now they buckled, split, and iced over in the same night. Rescue crews couldn't reach the worst villages for days. Blizzards grounded helicopters. Survivors sat inside collapsed houses with no heat, no power, and temperatures sliding below freezing. Some of the people who lived through the shaking didn't live through the nights that followed. Now scale that up. The Nankai megathrust is expected to be far larger, striking hundreds of kilometers of coastline at once. If it comes in deep winter, hypothermia starts working on the trapped and the injured long before rescuers arrive. Modelers quietly admit the cold could roughly double the death toll in the hardest zones. And there's a second timing factor no simulation has accounted for. The commute. Picture Tokyo at 8 in the morning. Around 8 million people are moving through the greater metro rail system in a single rush hour, threaded into cars that run on elevated viaducts and through tunnels bored deep beneath the city. Now imagine the megathrust hitting at that exact moment. Hundreds of trains in motion at once, some 50 meters underground, some suspended stories above the streets on concrete piers. The shaking arrives while they're all packed shoulder to shoulder, doors sealed, nowhere to step back. Trains derail, power drops across whole lines, water mains rupture and start feeding into the tunnels below the platforms. Tens of thousands of people could be trapped in the dark, underground, with the exits jammed and the air going stale. It's the single densest concentration of human beings the disaster could touch. But the rail companies have a plan they've never tested at scale. The emergency stop. After 2011, Japan built something quietly brilliant into the tracks. Seismometers positioned to catch the P wave, the faint first tremor that races ahead of the destructive shaking. When they sense a large quake, they cut power to the rails within about 3 seconds, and the trains begin braking before the violent S-waves ever arrive. During the Noto quake, it worked exactly as designed. Trains slowed and stopped, and no one aboard was killed by the shaking. On paper, it's one of the safest systems in the world. But a Nankai megathrust would send P waves roughly 10 times stronger, and the system carries a hidden failure mode. The braking is blind to where a train happens to be. If a packed train grinds to a halt in the middle of a tunnel, deep under the city, evacuation becomes almost impossible. And the deeper problem is that the shaking won't be the only threat the trains face. The liquefaction. Here's what shaking does to certain kinds of ground. In loose, waterlogged soil, the grains are packed together with water filling every tiny gap. When the earth trembles hard enough, those grains lose their grip on each other and the water takes over. Solid ground stops behaving like solid ground and starts behaving like a thick, grey liquid. Tokyo Bay is lined with districts that never existed as land. They're reclaimed seafloor, landfill poured over the bay to make room for a growing city. That kind of ground is exactly what liquefaction feeds on. In the 2011 quake, whose epicenter sat hundreds of kilometers away, liquefaction still wrecked around 20,000 homes in Chiba Prefecture, tilting houses, cracking streets, pushing manhole covers up out of the earth like corks. A full Nankai megathrust sits much closer, and the estimates are stark. Roughly 100 square kilometers of ground could turn to slurry, swallowing roads, snapping pipes, and dropping buildings off their foundations. And Tokyo Bay isn't the only place where the ground will fail. The valleys. Move inland, away from the coast, and you find a different kind of weakness. Japan's rivers have spent thousands of years laying down soft sediment, filling old valleys with deep beds of alluvium. That soft fill does something dangerous to seismic waves. It traps them, bounces them, and amplifies them, so the shaking arrives stronger and lingers far longer than it does on solid rock. Nagoya, a city of over 2 million, sits in one of these sedimentary basins. In a magnitude 9 scenario, the models suggest parts of the city wouldn't shake for seconds. They'd shake for 6 to 8 minutes, a slow, grinding violence that just refuses to stop. That matters more than it might sound. Building codes are written around a certain expectation of how long the ground will punish a structure. 6 to 8 minutes is longer than any modern code was ever designed to anticipate. But the engineering community believes most modern structures will survive. The buildings. And they have good reason to believe it. Japan's seismic building codes are the strictest on Earth, refined disaster after disaster. Skyscrapers rest on base isolators, giant rubber and steel bearings that let the ground move while the building above stays comparatively still. High up, tuned mass dampers, huge weighted pendulums, swing to cancel out the sway. The frames themselves are built to flex and bend rather than snap. The turning point was 1981, when the codes were sharply tightened. In 2011, the difference showed. Buildings raised after that line held up remarkably well, swaying through the shaking and staying standing while older structures suffered. But the Nankai Trough scenario asks more of them than 2011 ever did. The shaking could be roughly twice as strong and last about twice as long, pushing well-built towers toward the edge of what they were tested against. And there's one category of structure the engineers are deeply worried about. The towers. It's the very tall ones. A skyscraper has a natural rhythm, a period it likes to sway at, and for buildings above 60 stories, that rhythm is slow, several seconds per swing. A distant megathrust quake sends out long, rolling waves with almost exactly that timing, and when the two match, the tower drinks in the energy and keeps swaying long after the ground goes still. In 2011, the epicenter sat hundreds of miles from Osaka, yet high-rises there rocked for close to 10 minutes. Furniture slid, filing cabinets tipped, and loose objects on upper floors became projectiles skidding across the room. A Nankai rupture would drive those waves harder and longer, and there are now more than 300 buildings taller than 100 meters lining the trough's coastline. Each one is a column of glass and steel holding thousands of people who feel the floor moving like the deck of a ship. But the towers are designed to survive. The question is whether the people inside will. The elevators. Japan runs on roughly 700,000 elevators, and most of them are smarter than you'd think. Seismic sensors sense the first tremor, and the car glides to the nearest floor and opens its doors before the strong shaking arrives. It works beautifully for a quick jolt. A megaquake isn't a quick jolt. When the shaking stretches on for minutes, power fails mid-descent, counterweights swing, cables can fray, and cars jam between floors with people sealed inside. Thousands could be trapped at once, in the dark, not knowing if anyone knows they're there. In a wide disaster, rescue crews are pulled 100 directions, and reaching a single stuck car might take days. After 2011, the Tokyo Fire Department had to free about 12,000 people from elevators that had locked up across the city. That was from a quake centered far away. And even those who make it out of the buildings face a gauntlet to reach safety. The streets. Step outside and the street is its own hazard. Glass sheets shake loose from high facades and come down like guillotines onto the sidewalk. Vending machines, and there are millions of them in Japan, topple across walkways. Snapped power lines whip down and spark against wet asphalt. Water mains rupture underground, and intersections geyser upward until the roads run like rivers. In the densest districts, everyone pours out at once, and the crowd funnels toward the same narrow gaps between buildings, the same stairwells, the same bridges. Bodies press together faster than they can move. In the 1923 Great Kanto earthquake, crushing crowds and the panic that followed killed thousands who never felt a building fall on them. Today's cities are taller, tighter, and hold far more people in the same square mile. And in coastal cities, the crowds won't be fleeing the quake. They'll be fleeing what comes after it. The countdown. The first sound is the sirens. Then the phones, all of them at once. That flat electronic tone that means the earthquake early warning system has done its job. Loudspeakers on poles crackle to life in a voice that never rises, repeating the same words. Move to high ground. Do not wait. Do not go back. In some towns along the coast, tall concrete evacuation towers stand ready for exactly this, staircases spiraling up above the height the water is expected to reach. People climb them in seconds, strangers pulling strangers up the last steps. In towns without them, the plan is simpler and harder. You run uphill. Parents carry children who are too heavy to carry. Cars pile into intersections and stop, because everyone had the same idea at the same moment, and now the road is a wall. So the drivers leave the keys and run too. Every second of that head start matters, because the wave is already coming. But in the towns nearest the rupture, the warning won't arrive in time. For them, the ground shaking is the only alarm they'll get. The drawback. Before the water arrives, it leaves. The sea slides back from the shore, further than anyone has ever seen it go, peeling away from the sand like a blanket pulled off a bed. The harbor floor appears. Fishing boats settle sideways into the mud. Fish flip in shallow pools, where a meter of water stood a minute ago. To anyone who knows what it means, this is the warning built into the ocean itself. The trough of the wave has reached shore first, and the crest is right behind it. But it doesn't look like danger. It looks like a strange gift, a seafloor laid bare, and people walk out onto it. They photograph the stranded boats. They pick up shells. In 2011, cameras caught crowds standing in exposed harbors along the Tohoku coast, looking out at the horizon in the last quiet seconds. They had no way to know how little time they had, and when the wave finally arrives, it doesn't look like the movies. The surge. There's no towering blue curl, no perfect crest you could surf. What comes instead is a surge, a dark churning wall of water already thick with everything it has swallowed. Mud, timber, cars, the fronts of houses. It moves at the speed of a car on a highway, and it doesn't break and retreat. It just keeps coming. It pushes boats and shipping containers ahead of it like battering rams, and whatever those hit, they flatten. And the first wave isn't always the biggest. People who survive it and step back into the open can be caught by the second or the third, which arrive minutes apart, each finding a coastline already broken and easier to cross. The water doesn't drain away in seconds either. It floods inland for kilometers, filling streets and fields and rice paddies, and then it turns and pulls back toward the sea, dragging everything it lifted out with it. Cars, boats, people, whole buildings, carried out past the shoreline. And the coastline the tsunami strikes won't be the coastline that existed before the quake. The subsidence. And here's the part that never comes back. When the megathrust finally lets go, the overriding plate snaps seaward and the land nearest the trench drops with it. The coastline doesn't just flood, it sinks, permanently, by a meter or two, in a matter of seconds. Think about what that means for a harbor. A port built at sea level suddenly sits below it. The tide that used to lap at the docks now rolls straight over them, twice a day, forever. Whole waterfronts become lagoons that no pump can drain, because the ground itself is lower than the ocean. This isn't a projection. In 2011, parts of Ishinomaki subsided so far that neighborhoods still flood at high tide years later, streets that go under and resurface with the moon. The sea simply moved in and stayed. But the Japanese government has a plan to respond faster than they did in 2011. The response. The protocol is written and rehearsed. Within hours of a major quake, the self-defense force can mobilize up to 100,000 personnel. Helicopters lift toward the coast, amphibious vehicles roll toward the flooded zones, and field hospitals unfold where the buildings used to be. After 2011, they learned. They built regional stockpiles of food, water, and medicine, scattered so no single warehouse holds everything. They added redundant communication links so the network doesn't fall silent when the towers do. They trained civilian volunteers to hold the line in the first hours, before the uniforms arrive. On paper, it's one of the most prepared responses any nation has ever assembled. The people are ready, the supplies are staged, the orders are pre-written and waiting. All of it assumes the machinery survives the shaking, and the plan assumes the roads will be passable. The bridges. So picture the roads. Japan rebuilt much of its elevated highway network after the 1995 Kobe quake, when a mile of the Hanshin Expressway rolled onto its side. The new viaducts are stronger, braced and reinforced, designed to ride out a violent shake. But a megathrust doesn't shake like Kobe did. It pushes sideways with a force that lasts not seconds, but minutes, working the same support columns over and over until concrete cracks and spans slip from their bearings. A single dropped section turns a highway into a dead end. And one road matters more than any other. The Tomei Expressway is the artery between Tokyo and Osaka, the spine that everything else feeds into. If it fails, ground transport of aid and supplies could stall for weeks while crews rebuild in the aftershocks. And there's a single point of failure that would sever Japan's logistics network entirely. The ports. Now think about how almost everything you touch arrives here. In Japan, 99% of trade moves by sea, funneled through a handful of megaports like Nagoya and Osaka. They don't stockpile much. Goods flow in just in time, unloaded and trucked out within hours of docking. A Nankai megathrust wouldn't hit those ports one way, it would hit them three ways at once. The tsunami floods the terminals, subsidence drops the quays below the waterline, and liquefaction turns the reclaimed land underneath into something closer to wet sand. After 2011, it took 6 months to restore full port capacity along the Tohoku coast. A Nankai rupture would damage roughly 5 times that much port infrastructure, all in the region that handles the bulk of the country's imports. And without those ports, Japan's fuel supply runs dry in 3 weeks. The refineries. Follow that fuel back to where it's made, and you find it stacked along the same coastline the wave is coming for. The refineries cluster around Osaka Bay. The tank farms line the shore in Shizuoka. Almost all of it sits inside the tsunami inundation zone. We've already seen what one of these can do. In 2011, the Cosmo oil refinery in Chiba caught fire and burned for 10 days, spheres of gas rupturing one after another. That was a single facility, far from the worst of the shaking. A Nankai megathrust could ignite several at once, seawater and ruptured tanks feeding fires that merge into firestorms bright enough to see from orbit. And even the ones that don't burn would sit idle for months, cutting off the gasoline that ambulances, generators, and rescue trucks all run on. But the most dangerous industrial facilities aren't the ones that burn. The reactors. Along this same stretch of coast, Japan operates 10 reactors, and several sit within 100 kilometers of the Nankai Trough. After Fukushima, every one of them was rebuilt for a day like this. New seawalls, backup power moved uphill, venting systems designed to keep the pressure from tearing the containment apart. But one plant sits in a place the others don't. Hamaoka rests almost directly above the zone where the fault is expected to rupture, close enough that the shaking and the wave would arrive nearly together. Its seawall was built to hold back a tsunami of 21 meters. The government's own worst-case model predicts a wave of 24 meters. That's 3 meters of water the barrier was never designed to stop, arriving at the one reactor with the least room to be wrong. And even if the reactors survive, the spent fuel pools might not. The fuel pools. Picture a swimming pool perched 4 stories up, near the top of the reactor building, holding thousands of spent fuel rods that are still fiercely radioactive years after they left the core. They sit underwater because water both shields the radiation and carries away the heat they never stop producing. Pumps circulate that water constantly. Cut the power to those pumps, and the water slowly heats, then boils, then falls. Once the rods are exposed to open air, they can overheat, their cladding can catch fire, and there's no containment dome above a fuel pool to hold anything back. This is almost exactly what unfolded at Fukushima's Unit 4 in 2011. The building had exploded, the pool was cracked and losing water, and for days engineers weren't sure how much was left. What saved it was a leak in the wrong direction, water from an adjacent gate seeping in and keeping the rods barely covered. Not a plan, not a safety system, luck. But there's a scenario the government has never publicly discussed. The cascade. Start with the magnitude 9 rupture itself, the seafloor lurching, the wave building. The tsunami reaches the coast and floods the refineries, tanks of fuel and chemicals torn open, and the flooding sparks fires that spread across the water's surface, lifting clouds of toxins over the escape routes. People try to flee inland, but that's where the shaking already brought buildings down and buried the roads. Ambulances can't move. Hospitals fill past capacity in the first hour, and then the power to those hospitals fails too. Somewhere in that same window, a damaged reactor begins venting radiation, and the news of it ripples out faster than any evacuation plan can absorb. Now millions of people are trying to leave at once, onto highways already broken, past fires they can't drive through. Each failure removes an option for the next one. The quake makes the tsunami deadlier. The tsunami makes the fires possible. The fires close the roads. The closed roads trap the sick. And this cascade has happened before, not in Japan, but close enough to study. The Indian Ocean. On the morning of December 26, 2004, the seafloor off Sumatra broke along 1,300 kilometers of subduction zone, tearing open for close to 10 minutes. It measured magnitude 9.1, the third largest earthquake ever recorded. The energy released set the entire planet ringing like a bell. The tsunami spread out across the Indian Ocean and reached 14 countries. In the end, it killed around 230,000 people. There was no warning system in place, no network of sensors, no sirens, no alert to send. Survivors in Sri Lanka and Thailand described the same thing again and again. The sea drew back, and then it came. No message reached them, no time to climb, no higher ground within reach. For most of them, there was simply no chance. But Japan isn't Indonesia, and the question is whether preparation can overcome geology. The drills. In Japan, readiness starts young. Children practice earthquake drills from the age of 5, dropping under desks, filing outside in quiet lines, learning the motions until they turn to instinct. Neighborhood associations keep water and rice set aside, and whole towns run tsunami exercises, where everyone walks the route to high ground, timed, rehearsed, repeated year after year. When the water came in 2011, that culture worked. In town after town along Tohoku, people who had climbed those hills in practice climbed them again for real, and thousands lived because their feet already knew the way. Preparation, it seemed, could answer geology. But every drill assumes certain things. It assumes daylight. It assumes roads that are still there, instructions that still reach you, a body that can still climb. Take those away, and the plan starts to fray at the edges. And the Noto quake revealed that even Japan's readiness has limits. The breakdown. On New Year's Day 2024, a magnitude 7.6 quake struck the Noto Peninsula. Within 48 hours, some evacuation centers had run out of food. Roads stayed blocked for a week, cut by landslides and buckled asphalt, so aid couldn't get in and people couldn't get out. In shelters without heat, elderly residents died of hypothermia through the winter nights, waiting for help that was still trapped behind the mountains. And this was the smaller version of the story. Noto was powerful, but it was localized, one peninsula, one stretch of coast. Now imagine those same failures unfolding not in one place, but across 10 prefectures at once. The empty shelves, the severed roads, the cold, all of it multiplied and happening everywhere the same night, with no untouched neighbor close enough to help. And the deeper problem is that the people most at risk are the least able to evacuate. The demographics. Along much of Japan's rural coast, the towns have grown old. In some, more than 40% of residents are over 65, many living alone in wooden houses that have settled with the decades. A good number have no car. When the alarm sounds, they don't run. They rise slowly, reach for a cane, and start toward a shelter that may be kilometers away. That gap between the warning and the water is measured in minutes, and minutes are exactly what a slow walk cannot spare. After 2011, the pattern in the death records was quiet and clear. Mortality was highest among the elderly. Not because they didn't understand the danger, and not because no one had told them where to go. They knew. They simply couldn't move fast enough to outrun the sea. But age isn't the only factor that determines who survives. The knowledge gap. Think about who's left. The people who felt the ground buckle in 1944, who watched the water come in 1946, are now in their 90s. Their memories are the sharpest tools Japan has, and they're slipping away, one funeral at a time. The younger generations have the drills. They know the routes, the sirens, the phone alerts. What they don't have is the animal certainty that comes from watching your neighbor's house dissolve into the sea before your eyes. After 2011, researchers walked the coastline and noticed something unsettling. Towns where an elder had lived through the older quakes and had shouted at everyone to run higher and faster lost far fewer people. Where that living memory had died, the death tolls climbed. And that memory is what scientists are now racing to preserve, not through stories, but through stone. The new stones. Along the Nankai coast, communities are carving new tsunami stones, not old weathered warnings from centuries past, but fresh markers cut with the lessons of 2011, etched with GPS coordinates that point to the nearest safe ground. Each one is set at the estimated waterline of a worst-case megathrust wave, the exact height the models say the sea could reach. So they're two things at once: a cultural artifact meant to speak to people not yet born, and a disaster map you can read with your bare hands in the dark. They're built to outlast the next 100 years of concrete, seawalls, and coastal sprawl, quiet enough to be ignored until the day they're the only thing that matters. But the scientists worry that stones won't be enough this time. The number. There's a single figure that sits behind the eyes of every seismologist in Japan. The official probability of a great Nankai earthquake within the next 30 years is 70 to 80%. Sit with what that means for someone alive right now. Not a distant abstraction across geologic time, but a coin weighted heavily toward heads, waiting to be flipped inside a single human lifetime. The child starting school this year could easily still be middle-aged when it comes. That number gets printed on government reports and read aloud on the news, and most people have learned to live beside it the way you live beside a sleeping animal. But a probability is only a warning if someone builds against it, and what Japan has quietly poured into the ground beneath those cities changes the story entirely. The ground beneath. Go into an ordinary Tokyo elementary school and look up. Since the 1990s, tens of thousands of these buildings have been quietly wrapped in steel bracing and thickened concrete, retrofitted so the roof stays over the children's heads when the floor starts to move. It's the kind of work you never notice, hidden inside walls, invisible until the day it matters. The tallest towers go further. They float. Base isolation sets whole skyscrapers on layers of rubber and lead bearings, so the ground can lurch a foot sideways while the building above sways gently and stays whole. Along the coast, seawalls now rise higher than the houses behind them, and millions of people rehearse the same drill every year until moving to high ground becomes muscle memory. It is one of the most determined acts of engineering any nation has ever attempted against its own planet. And yet every wall, every sensor, every reinforced beam rests on one assumption the Earth has never once agreed to honor. The limits. That assumption is that we'll have some warning. And here the science turns honest with itself. Japan has laced the seafloor off its coast with hundreds of instruments, cables running for kilometers across the ocean floor, listening for the faint groan of rock under strain. They can feel the plates locking. They can measure, to the centimeter, how much the land is being dragged and bent. What they cannot do is name the day. Decades of data, and the fault still refuses to announce itself. The strain builds silently, then releases in seconds, and no instrument yet made can tell you if that release comes tonight, next year, or 40 years from now. Prediction, in the way people wish it worked, simply doesn't exist. So if the exact moment can never be known, the question stops being when the fault will move and becomes something far stranger about the time we are living in right now. The long now. Pull back far enough, and a pattern emerges from the noise. For as long as the written archives go, and further still in the layers of sand that ancient waves shoved inland, this trough has torn open on a rhythm of roughly 1 to 2 centuries. Again and again, across more than 1,000 years of records, the same slow heartbeat. The last great rupture was in 1946. Do the arithmetic, and you realize we are not waiting for the window to open. We are already standing inside it, in the quiet part, the long exhale between one catastrophe and the next. There's a strange tenderness to living here, in the interval. Cities glow, trains run to the second, children grow up never having felt the big one, all of it balanced on a pause that could hold for another lifetime, or end before this sentence does. Which leaves only one thing left to say about the strain still gathering, silently, a few kilometers below the waves. The silence before, so here's where the story rests, though it doesn't end. The fault along the Nankai Trough is locked, the way it has been for over a century. The two plates gripping each other while the Philippine Sea Plate slides under Japan by about 4 to 6 centimeters a year. That motion doesn't stop. It just waits, stored as strain in rock that hasn't moved. Everything we've followed points to the same quiet truth. The pressure is real. The slow slip is measurable. The tsunami stones still stand. The seawalls are higher. The drills happen every year, and still no one can tell you the day. That's the reason scientists keep watching. Not because something looks wrong, but because nothing does. The calmest surface can sit above the deepest tension, and Japan has learned to live gracefully on top of it. Consider what the instruments actually see. The GPS stations dotting Japan measure ground movement down to a few millimeters a year, and along the Nankai margin, some points creep steadily landward, storing strain like a spring wound one turn at a time. When a slow slip event releases a little of that tension, it can last days or weeks and never shake a single window. The 1854 Ansei quakes offer a quiet warning. Two great ruptures struck barely 32 hours apart, the eastern and western halves of the trough letting go almost back to back. That's the scenario planners fear most, one segment nudging its neighbor past the breaking point before anyone has recovered. So the watching never really stops. Ocean bottom sensors listen for tremor humans can't feel, and every reading gets folded into models that estimate, not predict, the odds across coming decades. As of 2024, the trough is silent, the tension is gathering, and the interval holds. This story isn't over, not even close. If you'd like to keep drifting through nights like this one, stay with us, and we'll keep telling them.